Hey class, I'm going to talk about the reading you did with Augustine and Aquinas. You see Augustine's dates here. He's actually in a very unique historical position. He's a Catholic bishop, and again, at this time, that means the Catholic Church is the only Christian church around. He's very sort of high up in the Catholic Church and has a prominent voice. And he has a unique position because he's one of the first bishops to have to struggle with this sense of just war. Early on in Christian history, after Christ dies and is raised, they're persecuted by Rome. Remember, Jesus lives in a time when Israel is under Roman occupation. And so Rome rules, and they don't like Christians, and they persecute them. They feed them to lions. They martyr them. And so Christians have to sneak around. House churches form. It's like a very covert thing. Many of them are martyred. They don't resist. They're nonviolent as a group. And this continues, right? But over time, Rome becomes more Christian, and Constantine, the Roman emperor, in the 4th century, converts to Christianity. And as he converts to Christianity, he basically makes all of Rome Christian. I mean, if you're not Christian, you're excommunicated, you're killed, it's not good for you. So suddenly we've got the first Christian empire. Well, here's the issue, right? Now that we have a Christian empire, Rome has real enemies that want to attack it. And they've got to defend themselves, and Rome wants to expand in certain areas. And so all of a sudden now we've got to figure out, if we're a Christian empire, when is it just for us to go to war, and when is it not? We've never had to consider that before because we were a martyred church who were committed to nonviolence, and now suddenly we're an empire with the most powerful military in the world. So what does this look like? So Augustine has the unique challenge of trying to think through these issues. When is it okay to go to war, and when is it not okay? Specifically for Christians, right? As a Catholic bishop, that's what he's concerned about. And so we get this very early version of just war theory that basically has you might be able to derive 3 criteria from it. We'll talk about that a little bit. So the first thing Augustine says is not all killing, not all violence, not all lethal violence is immoral, right? And so he says there's a difference between Moses killing the Egyptian before he went off and before the burning bush and all that, right? He sees an Egyptian beating an Israelite slave, and Moses kills the Egyptian and then flees. There's a difference between that and Abraham's willingness to murder his son Isaac. The question is, what's the difference, right? It seems like Moses would be justified. There's an Egyptian soldier beating a slave, and Moses protects the slave and kills the Egyptian soldier. That seems justified, justifiable homicide, right? On the other hand, you've got Abraham, who has an innocent child, Isaac, and he's going to kill Isaac. That seems to be more contemptible. But Augustine says, no, it's just the opposite. Moses killing the Egyptian is immoral, it's unjust. Abraham willing to kill Isaac is moral and just. And the difference is God commanded Abraham to kill Isaac. God did not command Moses to kill the Egyptian. Only the proper authority has the right to declare violence and war. So we get this sense of just war theory, that proper authority. You are not allowed to take up violence on your own. It has to be instituted or sanctioned by God, right? And that's the primary person who sanctions violence, God. Throughout the whole Old Testament, right? If violence is just, it's because God commands it. It seems that way in the New Testament, that God has that authority. Humans who are selfish and unwise and sinful don't have the authority. Augustine makes the same claim, right? You've got Israel who will cross the Jordan River, and they will engage the Canaanites in war. They're the aggressors. They will aggress against the Philistines and the Perizzites and all these different groups, right? And Augustine says, yes, this is moral, this is just, because Israel doesn't do it on its own. Israel doesn't even want to do this. They think they're going to lose in battle because these armies are so much bigger, stronger, and more well-trained. But the reason that these are just is that God commands Israel to do it. And then he contrasts that with Paul, who before he became a Christian on the road to Damascus, Paul was a Pharisee, a Jew, who was killing Christians. Paul was going around systematically killing Christians for the Roman government. And Augustine says the difference here is that Israel in the Old Testament was commanded to go into the land of Canaan and kill. Paul was not commanded by God to kill the Christians. We need a proper authority for it to be moral. Therefore, these are moral that are commanded by God. These are immoral that are not. Okay? So this is sort of his primary criteria. Now, what constitutes a proper authority? We've already mentioned God. He also says governmental leaders. Basically, Augustine is referring to the emperor or the king, the monarch. The reason is that because of Romans 13, which says, right, all governmental authorities are sort of instituted by God, ordained by God, given their authority by God, that these worldly powers sort of represent God on earth. So if the king declares war, the king has been given God's authority, according to Romans 13 for Augustine. Therefore, that war is just, and the military and the citizens should feel free to participate in that war. So the proper authorities are God, the emperor, the monarch, because they've been given God's authority. Now, Augustine says, sometimes the king gets it wrong. The king doesn't listen to God, doesn't follow God's command, and it commands that which is wrong. And Augustine says the military, the soldiers, should follow the king and do what the king commands. Even if the war ends up being unjust in the eyes of God, the soldiers are not responsible. They're supposed to be faithful to the king. Their call is to be loyal and obedient, right? The person who will be judged by God is the king who didn't listen. So soldiers are not responsible for deciding whether a war is just or unjust. Soldiers simply follow the emperor or the monarch who's been given the authority by God. If they happen to be wrong, the emperor or the monarch are the ones that will have to answer for it to God. So God is the ultimate authority. He's given authority to worldly leaders, right? That's how it works. The other criteria other than proper authority that Augustine mentions is right intention. That for war to be just, you have to have the right intention. And on 273, towards the middle there, I'm going to read a little bit. He gives you some of the wrong intentions for war. So what are the intentions that make war unjust? The real evils in war are love of violence, revengeful cruelty, fierce and implacable enmity, wild resistance, and the lust for power. It is generally to punish these things when force is required to inflict the punishment that, in obedience to God or some lawful authority, good men undertake wars when they find themselves in such a position as regards the conduct of human affairs. The right conduct requires them to act or to make others act in this way. So, for power, money, love of violence, revenge, wrath, these are the unjust intentions. Instead, we have to, again, promote the overall good, protect the innocent. We need to do that in obedience to God. These are the right intentions. So we've got these two basic criteria and the start of a just war theory. Now, Augustine makes it clear that Christians are not called to nonviolence. He says when the Roman soldiers come to Jesus and them, he doesn't say, I believe this might be Paul in Acts, they don't say, now that you're Christian, you've got to get out of the military. They tell them to go, not to sin and to do violence to no man, but they certainly don't say, remove yourself from the military, which means they're going to have to be in war at some point. And so, for Augustine, this is clear, along with other passages, that Christians are not necessarily called to be nonviolent, right? And some point to Matthew 5:39 here, that says, if you're slapped on one cheek, you turn the other as well. Do not resist an evil person. Love your enemy. And Augustine says, yes, that's true, but that's not to be taken externally, but more internally. He says this is about our heart. We should not wish to hurt another person. We should not wish another person ill. We should not wish to get revenge on a person. So that these passages in Matthew are more about our attitude towards our enemies, our attitudes towards those who hurt us, but it's not about our external actions. So that if God commands me to go to war, I do it not because I hate my enemy, not because I wish my enemy ill, but simply because I'm obeying God. I'm loving God through my obedience. And as long as that's the case, I can follow the passages in Matthew about loving my enemy, and I can still engage in war, because it's more about an internal disposition. Some people make the same claim about money and wealth, that the passages in Scripture are more about my desire for wealth or my attachment to wealth. It's more about internally how I view it and how much I want it and pursue it. But it's not really about having money, right? It's okay to be rich as long as I don't love my money or something like that. It's more of an internal disposition than an external behavior. And so that's sort of how Augustine interprets the Matthew passages about turning the other cheek and loving your enemy. So again, at this point, I'm curious. I want you to be thinking about some of these things. Do we like Augustine's Just War theory at this point? Do we feel comfortable saying, well, God commanded us, so it's just, right? Does that make us nervous? Makes me nervous. Lots of people say God told me to do it. The terrorist attacks on 9/11, they believed Allah commanded them to do it. And in fact, they believed it so much that they were willing to die in obedience. Do we trust that God commanded that? Right? Well then, why should anyone trust us when we say, oh yeah, God told me to do it? We have women saying, God told me to kill my children. It was a command to rescue them from the devil and to send them to heaven. We believe that during the Crusades, right, God's telling us to go kill the Muslims, the infidel. When pilgrims come to the United States, God's telling us this is the new promised land. This is ours, God-given, and we're going to kill the savage Indians. Is that enough for us that people say God commanded? Do we need more evidence? Do we need more criteria, like with Just War theory? How do you feel at this point? Do you think that all worldly authorities are instituted by God? Right? Do we really want to say that Hitler was instituted by God and given authority by God? Should Christians in Germany at that time been faithful and obedient to Hitler since he was instituted by God and listened to those governing authorities? Was Pol Pot ordained by God? The various Russian leaders who were Stalin and whatnot, are these instituted by God? Is the leader of Syria? I mean, these are questions that are tough to answer. Do we really want them to be the proper authorities for commanding war? So I want you to be wrestling with this, because if we say no, what do we do with those passages in the Old Testament when Israel goes into Canaan and kills everybody, every man, woman, and child, right? Even those that are innocent. How do we grapple with some of these difficult issues? Do we remove faith as the primary component of just war and institute reason, like just war theory, consequences, categorical imperative? I mean, how does that look? Let's talk about Aquinas briefly. You read both of these articles, right, for today. Aquinas is also a Catholic bishop, and you see his dates. He's coming about 800 years later. Just War theory's been around a little bit longer. He makes three criteria clear. He basically uses Augustine's model. He just adds a very clear criteria. Augustine's criteria are proper authority, which means God or a worldly authority like a king, a monarch, and whatnot. The second is there has to be a just cause, and this is a clear addition to Augustine, okay? Just cause, and he makes it clear. He says the second criteria is just cause, namely that those who are attacked because they deserve it on account of some wrong they have done. So war is only just when we're attacking a person or group that deserves it, right? And then the third is right intention, which is very similar to Augustine, right? Where we have to will to protect innocence, to create the overall maximum good, and to be faithful to God. What's interesting about Aquinas, though, is he adds this caveat that says clergy, pastors, priests, should not participate in war, even if it's just. So even if the war is perfectly just, clergy should not participate, because War is disturbing, and so priests are not able to contemplate God, not able to pray, not able to do those things that they've been called to do. 2, clergy should not participate in war because clergy are here to represent Christ, to serve communion, and you cannot represent Christ accurately and engage in war. So he makes it clear that the priest should be willing to die like Christ and model that for the world, but the priest cannot model Christ and kill in war. And this is very interesting, right? A very interesting component, because if in fact, I should ask the question this way. Do you agree that priests serve a totally different function than the rest of us? Priests are called to represent Christ to the world. Aren't I called to represent Christ to the world? Aren't you? Aren't we a nation of priests and rulers, right? A holy nation, a priesthood. And God calls the church that, or Israel that, in the Old Testament, and in Peter, that seems to be the name for the church, that we're all to be Christ-like, to be a community that represents the kingdom of God on earth, right, as it is in heaven. So if a clergy can't participate in war and represent Christ to the world, I then can't participate in war and represent Christ to the world. So should I participate in war at all? Is there really this sort of segregated notion that the priests play this role so they can't do war? I play a totally different role, and it doesn't really matter whether I imitate Christ well or not. I'll do something. That seems like an odd argument to make. If a war is just, and it's okay for Christians to participate, then shouldn't clergy participate too? And if it's unjust, then no Christians should participate. But to make these distinctions seems odd to me. So something, again, to think about, though. I hope this is helping. If you have any questions at all, please let me know, and I will see you online.